Disclaimer. J.K. Rowling is the master, even though she totally could have come up with a better title than The Crimes of Grindelwald. Hermione stood, silently and disillusioned, in the grimy black lots around the Ministry of Magic, and pondered how frighteningly easy it was to kidnap someone in the magical world. Of course, anyone could lie in wait for someone, but when you could be attacked from behind by an invisible assailant, and when you apparated into a place without knowing what was waiting for you there, you would have to have constant vigilance to avoid an attack like that. She wondered if there was a way to passively protect yourself from something like that, but so far all that came to mind was, "Don't be bloody predictable!" Sufficiently important people, like the Minister and Dolores Umbridge, had a security detail to worry about that kind of thing, but the average witch or wizard on the street didn't, and even in these times, if they felt safe to step out their door at all, they didn't really have to worry about an ambush attack, which was something Hermione was thankful for in this situation, as she waited for her quarry to appear. "First target, Mafalda Hopkirk," she thought. "Officially head of the Improper Use of Magic Office, off-the-books court scribe for the Magical Heritage Restoration Project. Apparates every morning in back of the theater at 8:35, give or take 5 minutes." At 8:37, a short witch with flyaway gray hair appeared in front of her. Even from the back, Hermione could tell she was the one she was looking for. A silent, stunning charm took her down before she knew there was anyone there. All too easy. George approached, only recognizable from the sound of his footsteps and a shimmer in the air, but Hermione saw Hopkirk's feet move and knew that he was helping her pick her up. The two of them carried her into the theater and set her down on the floor. Hermione canceled the disillusionment charms and plucked a few hairs from Hopkirk's head to add to the Polyjuice potion. George began rummaging through her pockets. According to their contacts in the Ministry, security was tighter now. You had to have an ID badge and special tokens to get in. Not enough in a world where things like Polyjuice Potion and legitimacy existed, but enough that simply walking in like the Death Eaters had done with her and Harry a year and a half ago wouldn't be possible anymore. "Here's her ID," George said once he found it, "and you'd better take these too." He handed her the card and the tokens. "I'll go watch for the guy while you take the potion. Non illuder." He disillusioned himself again and crept out the door. Hermione eyed the Polyjuice potion. It had changed from a muddy brown to a pleasant heliotrope color, but it still had a sulphurous odor like rotten vegetables, and a thick, sludgy texture. She decided not to take any chances and held her nose as she drank it, and she still barely managed to choke it down. Not only was the Polyjuice sludgy, but it was gritty, not to mention tasting like overcooked cabbage. She retched as she had a flashback to a particularly foul-tasting medicine she'd been forced to take as a little girl. Her mum had been tearing her hair out because it was so bad the taste actually made her vomit. She only got her to keep it down by mixing it with applesauce. She still didn't like applesauce. She managed not to vomit up the Polyjuice, but that was even worse, if it were possible, because as soon as she drank it, she felt like there were snakes crawling through her gut as it rearranged itself. A sensation of heartburn started, and then spread itself out through her torso and limbs, then crept up to her face. She was so hot she felt like her skin was boiling, and for a moment she worried that the potion had been sabotaged. She collapsed to her hands and knees like some magical Dr. Jekyll, except she felt her clothes growing looser rather than tighter. Hopkirk was shorter than she was. Her hair grew lighter and limp, and her hands thin and frail, at least compared to what she was used to. Suddenly, the writhing sensation under her skin stopped. The transformation was finished. Hermione was flat on the floor, face down. She tried to push herself to her feet. "Gah!" she gasped in pain. In all their planning, she'd never considered that Mafilda Hopkirk was over 40 years older than she was. All the little aches and pains that she normally didn't even notice were magnified. Sore back, sore knees, slightly weak vision. And Hopkirk wasn't even that old, only late middle-aged. True, Hermione felt fine enough once she got used to this new body, but she hadn't been expecting that. She made a mental note to remind herself to stay in shape at that age. Hopkirk didn't seem to be making much effort. "Hermione, can you help me with this?" George grunted. he was dragging their second victim into the door. "Philip Cornfoot, Ministry cafeteria worker, has access to the prisoners to distribute meals." Hermione was pretty sure he had a son in their year at Hogwarts. Not important now. She hurried to help George, almost tripping over robes that were now several inches too long. Cornfoot was shorter than George, but also fatter. His robes wouldn't fit at all with the transformation. They'd have to strip all of their workers to their underwear to acquire a convincing disguise anyway. Hermione searched the man's pockets for an appropriate ID while George dealt with the Polyjuice potion, retching and cursing through the transformation. A few minutes later, they both stood as properly dressed ministry workers. Hopkirk and Cornfoot were both fed a mild sleeping draught that would keep them out for a few hours. The Order of the Phoenix would be long gone by then. Now they needed their other two players. "Psst! George, Hermione, are you there?" a familiar voice called. Fred entered the theater, levitating a third man, younger and thinner, looking more like a brown-haired Percy than anything else. "Aloysius Quill, Ministry File Clerk, has access to the trial records for the proceedings that have already been concluded." Ironically, none of the four targets they'd selected were actually maintenance workers, but low-level staffers were a better choice in this situation. "Yes, we're here," Hermione whispered. "Come in and stay out of sight." Fred took the Polyjuice quickly and handled it surprisingly well. He looked the pair of them up and down. "I see I'm still the handsome twin," he said. Hermione rolled her eyes. "Everyone ready?" a deep voice called, and an imposing figure stepped through the door. Harry, or the man she hoped was Harry, was over 6 feet tall and powerfully built with curly black hair and a beard. "Albert Runcorn, officially archivist for the Magical Heritage Restoration Project. Unofficially, the man who gets his hands dirty so Umbridge doesn't have to. Pure blood, Death Eater sympathizer, and close associate of the Knott and Zabini families." He also had a child in their year. A Slytherin, naturally. Hermione raised her wands to the man, and George and Fred had theirs at the ready. He froze, but looked only momentarily surprised. He showed empty hands and said, "It's me, Harry." "Password?" Hermione hissed. "Bletchley Park." Hermione lowered her wand. "You got Runcorn, then?" she said. "Yeah," Harry answered. "He was alone, like the boss said." "Probably thought he looked too scary to take on," Fred suggested. "I'm surprised a wizard would make that mistake," Hermione muttered. "Where's the real Runcorn?" "At the dummy safe house, like we agreed." The Order had many real safe houses, plus a few that were fakes of a sort to throw the enemy off. "I only gave him a sleeping draught like you wanted, but he's tied up in a locked room, and I took his wand, so he won't be going anywhere for the next few hours." "Good, we'll deal with him after the op," she agreed. "Right, you're all ready?" Hermione nodded, and George said, "Yep," but then he grunted, "Ugh, not used to being fat. Let's get this over with." "Yeah, we'd better figure 50 minutes on the Polyjuice, so we'll have to move fast," Harry agreed. "Hermione, message Kingsley on your ring. Tell him we're moving in." "Right," she said. She tapped out the message on the upstream side of her Order ring to alert Kingsley and the others, and she and the twins followed Harry to the Ministry entrance. "Well, here we go," she said. "Into the belly of the beast." A thought struck her, and she added, "You know, for a school whose motto was, 'Never tickle a sleeping dragon,' we sure seem to be doing an awful lot of that." "Yeah, story of my life," Harry muttered. Hermione walked clumsily, not used to her smaller, less steady body. She'd never had the feeling of being uncomfortable in her own skin before, not like this. She felt like her flesh was hanging on her bones wrong, except the bones were wrong too. Mafalda Hopkirk's teeth were crooked, and she knew it was going to nag her the whole time. Her shoulders were just a tad hunched, too. She could only hope she wasn't drawing too much attention to herself. Apparition directly into the atrium, or anywhere in the building, had been blocked, probably the most sensible of the new security measures, and the poorly policed visitors' entrance was also closed. The only way in or out now, barring emergencies, was a set of public toilets that had been rerouted to the flues in the atrium, according to Kingsley's sources. They each took a token, and Hermione proceeded to the ladies' room. There was a large crowd of witches filing into the toilets. It was an interesting arrangement, quite dirty and unpleasant, but serviceable. Any muggle who wandered in would be naturally suspicious about the number of people who were walking in without walking out, but they wouldn't be able to open any of the cubicles without a token. She waved shyly to the woman who said hello, and resolved to come down with a sudden case of laryngitis if any of them insisted she talk to them, but people in these circumstances weren't prone to talk to each other unnecessarily. Hermione opened her cubicle and stepped inside, closing the door behind her. She was glad now for the intel Kingsley had given them, since she thought she might have been lost without it. She stepped up and into the toilet. Fortunately, despite appearances, it was both dry and had a flat bottom. All she had to do was pull a chain, and she was flushed down to a corresponding fireplace in the ministry atrium, complete with the appropriate sound effects. Ew. She stumbled as she emerged, still unsteady on her feet, but managed to right herself. Harry, George, and Fred emerged a few flues down, but she barely noticed. Her attention was preoccupied by the huge statue now dominating the atrium. There had been a golden fountain here before, until Dumbledore and Voldemort had held their duel and destroyed it. Now there was a statue of black stone, a statue of a witch and wizard holding their wands high as if gazing toward some bright future. But under their feet they stood on a tall pedestal of white marble, but it was broken off at the base, and its weight was held up by many smaller human bodies bent under the load beneath it. At the base, a motto was inscribed in foot-high letters. Magic is might. She stared at it far longer than she should have. The boys came up by her side. "Psst, Hermione!" George whispered, making her jump as she saw the three men standing near her. "This is new." "It's horrible!" she muttered softly. "Are those—" Harry started, looking at the bent figures. "Muggles," she said. She had a bad taste in her mouth. "In their rightful place." The statue was stark and monumental and disgusting, and she was quite certain she'd once seen a photo of a nearly identical statue in Russia of a man and a woman holding up the hammer and sickle. With all the Soviet-style propaganda floating around, she wondered if it was intentional. "Let's go," Harry muttered. "You all know the plan. Spread out." Hermione nodded and turned her eyes away from the abomination. They each had their own roles to play here, hammered in during their planning session. George would go to the cafeteria and give them a few minutes' head start before running over to the holding cells and releasing the prisoners. Fred would grab all the files he could from the records room. Harry would go to Runcorn's office and clean out all his files on his hunt for Muggleborns. They'd both brought magically expanded briefcases for the purpose. And Hermione? Ahem! A chill went through her. She turned and saw a squat, toad-like witch dressed all in girlish pink staring up at her. "Good, there you are, Mafalda," Dolores Umbridge said in her sickly sweet voice. "We want to get started on time, don't we? Come along." She snapped her fingers for her to follow and proceeded towards the lift. Yes, Madam Umbridge," she said. Hermione's job was to keep Umbridge busy until Harry had time to circle around to the courtroom and help disrupt the trials. Their goals were threefold there: free any prisoners in the courtroom, take down Umbridge herself if they could, and, most importantly, provide a distraction for the prisoners to escape. Hermione engaged with Umbridge as little as possible as they rode the lift down to the courtrooms. Just the sight of that woman filled her with mingled anger, fear, and a little bit of nausea. How had the people swallowed pardoning a woman who had used the Cruciatist curse on a child? The same way they swallowed everything else about this mad regime, of course. Propaganda. They reached the lowest level and stepped out, heading down to the courtrooms. Hermione still felt unsteady and made her way gingerly down the stairs, hoping she was being inconspicuous. Typically, Umbridge, eagle-eyed as ever, noticed. "Is something wrong, Mafalda?" she asked. "I just turned my ankle coming in, ma'am," Hermione said. Umbridge sniffed minutely and didn't say anything, but Hermione felt her heart start racing and her blood start to run cold all the same. But she quickly placed this feeling for what it truly was. Dementors. It had been over 3 years since Hermione had been directly confronted by a Dementor. She was stronger now than she was then, and she had practiced her Patronus charm almost every night since the night she had nearly been kissed. But she'd seen more, too. The darkness in her memories was darker, and she could hear the screams echoing in her head. She had to fight the urge to whip out her wand and cast the Patronus herself, which would have given her away immediately. She also prayed Umbridge wouldn't ask her to cast one. This was one of the biggest weak points in their plan. Her otter would give her away. She thought she could cast a non-corporeal version, but it wasn't something she normally practiced. Fortunately, Umbridge managed that herself. She pulled out her wand and cast Expecto Patronum! A silvery light appeared and formed itself into the shape of a cat. I can't believe that foul woman can cast a Patronus, Hermione thought. Umbridge hadn't been that cheerful, that genuinely cheerful anyway, nor that competent when she was a teacher. She almost couldn't believe it was a cat either, but here, at least, some of the ugliness within revealed itself. Umbridge's Patronus wasn't a cute kitten like she decorated her walls with. It was a scraggly, mean-looking alley cat. There was no pretense here of a mere academic investigation, or even humane treatment. There were a dozen Dementors guarding a row of a dozen prisoners in the hall, most of whom looked utterly broken, hiding their faces in their hands. Hermione felt the cold settle into her bones, and, as much as it galled her, huddled as close as she dared to Umbridge and her Patronus as she held the monsters at bay. The prisoners peered up at them in fear. One of them raised a blonde head, and Hermione recognized her, a young witch with a round face and hazel eyes. Penelope Clearwater, Percy's one-time girlfriend. The woman had tears running down her face, but Hermione had to stay strong and pass her by. Hermione hadn't seen the Ministry courtrooms in person before, but Harry had described them to her from seeing them in Dumbledore's Pensieve. This one was a claustrophobic octagonal room with a high ceiling. There were more Dementors in here, standing in the opposite corners. Yaxley was there, to her surprise. That could complicate things. And 2 guards were also maintaining Patronuses in the courtroom, so the danger was not too severe, as far as that went, although they clearly were only there to protect the judge's bench, not the accused. Hermione took her seat, and it wasn't hard to see what she was supposed to do. There was a stack of forms to fill out, and a dictaquill to record speech in real time. There also seemed to be a scroll for notes describing the proceedings that speech alone wouldn't capture. That would be the actual scrivener's work. She was still unsettled. Even with Umbridge's Patronus prowling between her and the Dementors, she felt the hopelessness of the chamber like a tangible thing, along with a nagging feeling that the whole operation was doomed to failure. Inquisitorial hearings for the Magical Heritage Restoration Project for the 15th of September 1997, Umbridge said. Investigating alleged Muggle-born wizards for interfering with Ministry of Magic business. Interrogators, Dolores Jange Umbridge, Senior Undersecretary to the Minister, and Head of Project, Corbin Yaxley, Head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, Court Scribe, Mafalda Hopkirk, Head of the Improper Use of Magic Office. Hermione took that as her cue to start taking notes. She picked up the quill to write, and only then did she notice the scars on her hand that read, "I must not tell lies," were gone. For some reason, that disturbed her more than it should have. "Bring in the first prisoner," Umbridge called. The doors of the courtroom opened, and a disheveled, dark-skinned young man stumbled in. He was thin and unkempt, but he still managed to gaze up at Umbridge with defiance in his eyes. Hermione had to bite back a gasp when she saw him. "Dean Thomas, sit down," Umbridge said, her soft, sickly sweet voice magnified to fill the courtroom. Dean kept glaring at her, but he sat in the chair in the center of the room. Chains immediately wrapped around his arms and legs, holding him in place. "You are Dean Nelson Thomas?" Umbridge asked. "Who wants to know?" Dean said. Umbridge didn't react. She just continued in her soft, silky tone. "Mr. Thomas, you are in a very precarious position, suspected of tampering with Ministry family records." "I wasn't bloody tampering," he said. "I was trying to find out who my dad was." Oh, Dean, Hermione thought. Why would he even try that? So he could get back into the magical world and fight? As far as they knew, no one was actually arrested for stealing magic. Those who were charged with things like resisting arrest or impeding a ministry investigation, and then their ancestry was looked into. For those Muggle-borns who were let go after that, the official documents said that they had been given wands as a clerical error, and the privilege had been revoked as a result. Hermione could see where that was going. If the regime was allowed to go on, they would eventually try to classify Muggle-borns as magical creatures, or maybe just creatures, and as such ineligible to use wands by conventional laws, and eventually stripped of the rest of their rights as well, a more roundabout way to reach the same destination.
"Your mother is Martha Thomas, a Muggle housewife?"
Umbridge pressed. Dean groaned. "If you must know, her legal name is Martha Clark. She changed her name to Martha Thomas when I was born. My dad gave his name as Edmund Thomas, but Mom thought that might not have been his real name."
"And where is your father now?"
"Dunno," Dean said. "He disappeared a few months after I was born."
"Hardly remarkable," Umbridge interrupted. "Probably just a Muggle tramp who didn't want to take responsibility for his son. That's a common reaction among Muggles."
"Don't talk about my dad like that!" Dean shouted, more forcefully than Hermione would have thought him capable of with the Dementors. "He told Mum he had to leave to protect us from something. It was in the last year, the last war. He didn't explain much, but after we found out I was a wizard, Mum put the clues together and figured out he must have been one too."
"A likely story,"
Umbridge said, taking the same patronizing tone she always did as a teacher.
"Awfully convenient that you can't produce any evidence of this supposed father, isn't it, Mr. Thomas?"
"Well, that's why I was trying to find evidence in the records," he answered.
"And why did you not come directly to us?"
"Because I didn't think it was smart to come to you without evidence." He rattled his chains. "And what do you know? Judging by how you're treating me, I was right."
"You are being questioned because you were detained on suspicion of tampering with Ministry records and impeding an official investigation. Nothing more," Umbridge said. "However, as you cannot prove your magical ancestry, there are certain other considerations."
"I'm telling you, my dad was a wizard," Dean growled. "If we can figure out who he might have been, I can prove it." Umbridge leaned forward and took on an inquisitive tone, but Hermione could tell she already knew what the outcome would be. "Dean, what are you doing?" she thought.
"Very well, Mr. Thomas," Umbridge replied. "Do you have any documentation as to the supposed identity of your father?"
"Not that I believe has his right name on it."
"Well, then, without any proof—"
"But there's got to be tests for that kind of thing," he yelled. "Hell, even Muggles have tests for that."
"Muggle tests can easily be tampered with."
"Isn't this whole thing supposed to be about finding hidden magical heritage of supposed Muggle-borns?" Dean said. "Shouldn't I be the poster boy for this farce?" He stopped and slumped back in the chair, letting out a hollow laugh. Hermione could see his hands were shaking. "Why am I even arguing this, bitch? We both know what this is about. You're mad that we all kicked your arse out of Hogwarts last year." Hermione shook her head subtly, trying to draw his attention.
"No, Dean, don't antagonize her," she thought. "The time to defy authority is not when there are bloody Dementors breathing down your neck."
What was he even doing here? He was supposed to be in hiding.
"Mr. Thomas, I demand respect in this courtroom,"
Umbridge said, starting to sound genuinely irritated. Hermione hoped the boys were making good progress, because she didn't know how much more of this she could take. She wanted to do something, her anger burning through the aura of despair, but she knew she couldn't take on Umbridge and Yaxley and hold back the Dementors at the same time. Dean demurred somewhat and continued arguing with Umbridge, asking her what the procedures were to locate and test a person's magical relations. Umbridge, for the most part, sprouted some vague platitudes and evaded the question. Hermione suspected there was no such procedure. Probably any evidence they presented was manufactured, and they weren't looking beyond people's self-reported heritage at all, just compiling a list of enemies of the state. Unfortunately, neither of them seemed to have much patience with the other. "I want to know what grounds you have to confiscate my wand," Dean demanded.
"You never had the right to carry a wand, Mr. Thomas," Umbridge replied. "There was a simple clerical error—"
"That's hippogriff dung, and you know it. The International Confederation of Wizards Convention on Wand Use of 1692 guarantees a wizard the right to carry a wand at all times."
"Not the criminals,"
Umbridge said primly. "Oh, charged with a crime now, am I?" he said. "That doesn't sound like a clerical error." Hermione hissed softly.
"You're not going to win this argument, Dean. Stop it." "That is enough," Umbridge said. "Since you cannot prove your status in the magical community, it is clear that you should not have been granted the privilege of carrying a wand."
"I am a wizard," Dean snapped. "I can pick up a wand and cast any spell you can. I don't know what dictionary you're using, but if you want to say I'm not a real wizard, grow some balls and say it."
"Enough! Mr. Thomas, I hereby declare you guilty of contempt of court and impeding a ministry business, and sentence you to 6 months in the ministry holding cells. Your wand privileges are revoked forthwith. Take him away."
The chains uncoiled, releasing Dean, and he sprang to his feet. 2 guards moved to grab him, but he fought against their grasp. "This is bollocks!" he shouted, but Hermione could see the tension in his face and neck. This is a kangaroo court, and everybody knows it."
"Desist now," Umbridge said, not raising her voice. "You are only making it worse for yourself by resisting."
Dean kept struggling. "You know how crazy this is," he told the guards. "Get off me! This whole thing is a sham!"
"This is your final warning," Umbridge said, softly. "If you continue to struggle, you will be subjected to the Dementor's kiss."
Dean went limp. Umbridge didn't give the order, but 2 Dementors swooped towards him, eager at the prospect of a potential meal. His composure finally cracked, and he flinched away from them, his knees shaking and tears trickling from the corners of his eyes. Hermione's blood ran cold, and her own patience ran out. She couldn't bear to see a friend subjected to the Dementors like that.
"Please hurry, Harry,"
she thought. She centered herself, focused on her memory of her favorite holiday with her parents when she was young, and drew her wand.
"Expecto Patronum!"
The silvery otter burst from her wand and swam through the air to encircle Dean, swatting Dementors and guards alike away from him. Umbridge, Yaxley, and the other R's stared in shock as Mafalda Hopkirk stood up in the middle of the courtroom with wand extended to protect a prisoner. However, Umbridge had seen her Patronus at her owl exam and soon put the pieces together.
"Granger!" she shouted.
No element of surprise now. Hermione snapped out her other wand and cast a silent summoning charm. Dean's wand flew from where it lay on the bench to her hand, and she tossed it to him. "Hermione?" he said in shock.
"Stay close,"
she said, maintaining the Patronus with one wand and casting spells with the other. She got close enough to him that her Patronus could protect both of them. Dean reacted quickly and started throwing hexes at the advancing R's as they backed towards the door. The 2 guards who had manhandled him were already down, stunned, but that still left 4 on 2, all trained except Umbridge, though she was no slouch, as Hermione had thought before. They backed away to the door, and Hermione blasted it open. The prisoners outside jumped at the commotion.
"That's Granger! Stop her!" Umbridge yelled.
"Avada Kedavra!" Yaxley shouted, and Hermione dodged the green spell, pulling Dean with her. They tumbled into the hallway and found themselves surrounded by yet more Dementors.
"Patronus!"
she ordered as she waved her wand back and forth, directing her own Patronus to scare the Dementors away. They backed off, but still pressed towards them as close as they could. The other prisoners stood, blinking into the light as the weight lifted. "Expecto Patronum!" Dean shouted, but his wand produced only a fizzle of light.
"Try harder! Try harder! Stupefy, Vander Wallace, Rigor Mortis!"
Her Patronus swam encouragingly around Dean and bathed him in its light. He waved his wand again. "Expecto Patronum!" His Patronus emerged fully formed. An impala, gracefully leaping around the corridor, and the combined light chased the Dementors further away.
"Stupefy! Avada Kedavra! Viscera Expellite! Carnifex!"
Yaxley and the other R's weren't pulling punches. One of the prisoners was struck by the killing curse and dropped like a stone. Another had a chunk taken out of his side.
"Damn it!" Hermione muttered. "Calcifrago!
Her silent spell struck the arch over the courtroom entrance, shattering the mortar, and the stone bricks collapsed, blocking it off just before Yaxley reached it. The whole corridor rumbled with the impact, and for a tense moment she worried the ceiling would collapse.
"What are you waiting for? Run!" she told the prisoners.
They ran. The Dementors fled from their Patronesses as she and Dean were caught up in the tide of bodies. Moments later she heard a crash behind her. Yaxley had blasted his way through the barricade. The corridor would be a shooting gallery for him. They had to get out of there. The Department of Mysteries was up the next flight of stairs, and if it were just her and Dean, she would consider hiding there like she had with Harry, but with this crowd, that wasn't an option.
"Does anyone else have a wand?"
she called. A few of them did. Perhaps they were family members of prisoners. Perhaps they had some reason they hadn't been confiscated. They started casting back at the R's, but they were demoralized, and they weren't fighters to start with. Penelope was the only one who managed a Patronus, but it was non-corporeal and barely held the Dementors at bay. Fortunately, the atrium was only one level above the Department of Mysteries, and she had asked Kingsley where the stairwells were. She didn't want to risk the lift. Her Muggle upbringing told her not to trust a lift in an emergency, and they were slow and could possibly be overridden. She motioned for the prisoners to follow her to the stairwell up to the atrium. That wouldn't go unnoticed, and the prisoners from the holding cells up on level 2 would have a much harder time, so she made the call, prayed she wasn't jumping the gun, and tapped out a message to Kingsley on her ring to go. A tall figure appeared in the stairwell, and the other Muggleborns froze in fear.
"It's Runecorn! We're trapped! Run!"
They turned and fled the only direction they could, towards the Department of Mysteries.
"No, no, it's Harry! Stop!"
Hermione cried. Dean and a few of the others stopped, but about half of them kept running. In retrospect, this was a serious flaw in the plan, although they hadn't planned on the prisoners running into Harry like this.
"Harry, Patronus, and get them out of here," she said.
"Expecto Patronem!" Harry bellowed, and a silver stag leapt from his wand and galloped down the corridor towards the Dementors, stunning all who were watching. Hermione turned and ran after the others. She heard Runecorn's booming voice behind them. "Get to the atrium, flew out, and get out of the country. There'll be people here to help you." Hermione heard footsteps running behind her. She turned and pointed her wand, but she saw it was Dean. His Dumbledore's army training had kicked in, apparently. They reached the spinning room, where the different divisions of the Department of Ministry converged. 2 of the doors were standing open. She quickly cast a spell to hold them there.
"Split up!"
she ordered. "That's really you, Hermione?" Dean said, finally having a moment to speak.
"Yes," she thought, and tried something. "Expecto Nuntium," she thought, giving her Patronus the ability to speak.
She concentrated on a message, and the otter spoke in her real voice.
"The Patronus doesn't lie, Dean." "Find the other prisoners. We have to get out fast," she said.
"On it," he said. They ran through separate doors. Hermione found herself in the dark room with the models of the planets, lit only by the spark of light at its center representing the sun, besides the doorway. She could hear scrambling footsteps ahead, but she didn't have time to catch up, so she sent her Patronus ahead of her to reach them.
"There's no way out this way," it spoke. "We have to get to the atrium. That wasn't Runecorn, it was Harry Potter. We're here to get you out of here. Follow me."
Her Patronus frolicked back in her direction as she approached at a brisk pace. It took a few moments for the prisoners to respond, but she soon heard shuffling footsteps moving in her direction.
"Hurry!"
she said when they approached. They made their way back to the entrance to the Department of Mysteries, but then it all went wrong. An alarm sounded through the Ministry, a loud animalistic screeching very different from Muggle alarms. At the same moment Hermione doubled over, not in pain, but from the writhing sensation that shot through her. She felt the feeling of snakes squirming in her gut and her skin crawling. The Polyjuice patient was wearing off. Already? Her Patronus winked out as her concentration broke. Mafalda Hopkirk's clothes grew tight, and she quickly cast a temporary resizing charm so they would still fit long enough to get away. But until it finished, all she could do was stagger forward towards the exit. Then it got worse. There was spellfire from outside. When they reached the round room, they had to stop and hide behind the door. Yaxley and Umbridge were there, flanked by 2 Dementors and casting lethal spells at them. Dean and the group he was leading hid behind the door to whatever room they had entered as well, casting back the best they could. Umbridge spotted her.
"Miss Granger,"
she said, still holding her own with her limited repertoire of spells.
"How nice of you to join us!"
Hermione responded with curses, and not all of the spell variety. She tried to clear her head enough to cast the Patronus charm again. It was hamstringing them, having to hold back the Dementors. There was only one other Muggle-born with a wand behind her, but she let him cover for her long enough to get the charm out.
"Expecto Patronum!"
she muttered, and the otter reappeared, and none too soon. One of the Dementors swooped at her, and she drove it away with as much force as she could muster, forcing it back against the door. But that was as far as she got. There was a shout and a crash and a loud crack. In the chaos, Hermione had lost track of how Dean was doing. Now she looked up and saw he was sprawled on the ground in front of Umbridge while the woman dropped the broken halves of his wand to the floor and spoke 2 words. Penelope summoned Dean with her wand and lunged to grab him, to pull him back and protect him, but it was the worst possible thing she could have done at the moment. The other Dementor, spurred on by Umbridge's order, swooped down blindly and grabbed Penelope by the chin instead of Dean. It lifted her up, pulled back its hood, and before anyone could stop it, placed its sucking orifice of a mouth over hers. Screams filled the air. Hermione realized that one of the screams was her own. Several of the prisoners retched and vomited on the spot. She had been shaken to the core by the existential horror of the very concept of the Dementor's kiss, but it was nothing compared with actually witnessing it. The only thing she could compare it to was the sense of impending doom that radiated from the killing curse in flight, only 10 times worse. A feeling of such visceral wrongness filled the chamber that she felt unclean just by being in its presence. The kiss only took a few seconds. Penelope's body slumped to the ground, still breathing, but brain dead. Hermione somehow knew that she wouldn't be able to cast a Patronus charm again without several hours of meditation, so she went in the opposite direction. She brought her wand up and reached for the darkest curse she knew.
"Potia Pantheon!"
she hissed, a curse that would cause blindness with ultraviolet exposure to the eyes.
"Rigor Mortis, Facio Sutra!"
That one struck home, a nominal healing charm twisted for offensive use. Yaxley recoiled in pain as surgical sutures stitched themselves into the intact skin of his face, extending across his forehead and down his neck from the force of it.
"Comimoto Chorus, Trigeminal Neuralgia, Emesis!"
A little used vomiting curse.
"Terebradent, Caridentibus!"
A stronger curse that would actually rot the teeth, not just drill them. But none of that would actually hold back the Dementors, and no one in the room was in a state to cast the Patronus charm. They couldn't hold out like that for long. And then Harry's silver stag burst through the door and sent the Dementors careening back into the Department of Mysteries with a shriek. Umbridge and Yaxley turned as a now normal-looking Harry, Fred, and Emmeline Vance bowled into the room, and the whole chamber descended into chaos. "Run!" Harry yelled.
"To the atrium!"
Emmeline added. Hermione pushed the other Muggle-borns along as Dean staggered to his feet. There were only 4 mobile besides Dean. He looked torn between helping and getting the others out, but Hermione shook her head. This wasn't his fight. He nodded his acknowledgement, then grabbed Penelope's limp body and threw her over his shoulder. Hermione didn't comment. They were fighting 4 on 2 at point-blank range. Yaxley was by far the more competent of the pair and engaged all 3 of the other Order members, while Hermione took on Umbridge. The Toad Woman was holding her own surprisingly well, though Hermione was pretty confident she could beat her if Yaxley didn't intervene. That didn't stop Umbridge from trying to get to her through taunts and sneers, though.
"You have a lot of nerve showing your face here, Granger," she taunted. "You've got a lot of nerve showing your face outside Azkaban, Umbridge," Hermione sniped back between spells. "I am an upstanding citizen doing my part to preserve the strength of the magical world," she replied haughtily. "You are a mudblood, a school dropout, and a coward who ran scared from me in the end." "I'd say discretion is the better part of valor." "Well, your discretion just chose wrong, mudblood," Umbridge sneered. "We'll take care of you and that obnoxious blood traitor of yours. Finish the job we started when the coward left the school." The memory of the whip coming down on George's bare back over and over again flashed through Hermione's mind. She acted. She shattered Umbridge's shield with an overpowered club-hand curse, a spell she had tweaked so that it could only be reversed by regrowing the bones.
She didn't give her time to recover as she let out a feral scream and snapped off a dozen dark spells in as many seconds, losing herself in the furious flashing of magic. "Hermione! Hermione!" A hand clapped her on her shoulder, and she spun, raising her wand, only to find it was Harry. Fred and Emmeline Vance stood beside him, mostly unhurt, but looking pale, staring at her with fear. Yaxley was nowhere to be seen.
"Harry!" she breathed.
"Bloody hell, what did you do to her?"
Harry said, staring down at Umbridge's prone form. He looked a little bit ill.
"I stopped her,"
Hermione said in a hard voice.
"Yaxley?"
"Ran for it. We have to get out of here before he comes back."
They ran out of the Department of Mysteries and back for the stairs. With luck, all of the prisoners from the courtroom had flued out by now. But just before they reached the stairs, Hermione heard a shout behind her and ducked almost on instinct.
"Watch out!"
she screamed. The four of them dove out of the way just before the killing curse flew between them and exploded on the stairs. Yaxley was right behind them. He must have been waiting to chase them back into the shooting gallery of the corridor. Hermione was casting spells behind her at him when she heard a growl from above. An enormous black dog leapt over her head and knocked Yaxley to the ground. Sirius was there. He was also a big target, but in some of the fastest transformation magic she'd ever seen, he transformed back to human form and rolled out of the way before Yaxley could get another curse off. "Run!" he shouted. Hermione didn't argue. Harry started to, but she and Fred pushed him along. Sirius could take care of himself. She hoped.
"Where's George?"
she asked.
"Kingsley and Dodge went to get him,"
Emmeline said. "He's here," Fred called. They emerged into the atrium. George, Kingsley, and Alpheus Dodge were running in from the lifts and heading for the fireplaces, followed by the prisoners from the holding cells.
"Get your asses moving!"
a gravelly voice yelled. Moody and Hestia Jones were standing by one of the fireplaces, defending it, Hestia casting with her left hand. The first group of prisoners had seemingly got out, but the two Order members couldn't stop the other method of blocking them. Portcullises were dropping down over the flues, one by one. According to Kingsley, they were impervious to basically all locking charms, and blasting them out would be risky at best. There was no way they could get to any of the fireplaces in time.
"We're trapped,"
Emmeline said.
"We're not,"
Hermione told her. How about a spell that bypasses locking charms, she thought. She focused as much power into the spell as she could and cast it at the nearest fireplace.
"Atithecula!"
There was a shower of sparks and a shriek of shearing metal, and the porculus shot out of the fireplace and flew across the atrium. There was a howl as Sirius was thrown out of the stairwell, in dog form again, and flew into the opposite wall and collapsed in a tangle of limbs. Hermione's heart skipped a beat. Sirius transformed back to human and stood, limping to join them, but they didn't get a reprieve. The Ministry's security was pouring into the atrium from the lifts, both ours and the ordinary security guards.
"It's Potter! Stop them!"
Yaxley yelled. Spells flew across the atrium, and the regular Ministry workers ducked and ran for cover. They made it to the fireplace and started sending the prisoners through while the fighters held off the mounting attack. Once they were through, Emmeline, Dodge, and Kingsley went next, and then everything went white. For a few moments all Hermione knew was pain. Her ears were ringing, she had a nasty bump on the head, and she was sprawled across the floor with cuts and burns all over her body. Her body was sluggish in getting up. What had happened? She tried to think back to whether she'd heard a spell cast. Pettigrew's fragmentation grenade curse? Something else? Whatever it was, it had blown up the fireplace they were using. She could only hope Kingsley had got out okay. He'd been the last one through. She took stock. Wands? Check. Both were still clenched tight in her fists and ringing with magic, though she had to wonder if they would still be intact if she hadn't reinforced them with nanofibers. Arms? Check, obviously. Legs? To her relief, her legs obeyed her. She jumped to her feet, pushing through the pain with sheer adrenaline. Her hearing was still off. She was pretty sure she was deaf in one ear, but for the other, sound was getting through again. Hermione spun, taking stock. George and Fred were on their feet, still holding off the advancing security. They looked like they'd taken a beating too, but they hadn't been as close to the blast. Sirius was still making his way to them. Harry was staggering to his feet. Hestia Jones' prosthetic arm was mangled, but it looked like it had absorbed the entire brunt of the impact for her. A built-in shielding charm? And Moody... Mad-Eye Moody was lying on his back in a pool of blood, one eye socket empty, his eye rolling across the floor. His other eye was open and staring blankly. Hestia was shouting at her. They needed another exit. Hermione ran. There was no time to get Moody's body, though Hestia summoned his eye as she passed. They ran past the giant statue, towards the more distant bank of fireplaces. Yaxley was still walking towards them, inexorable, with more R's behind him. They needed to slow him down somehow. They couldn't risk him blowing up another flue. She paused as she passed the statue, as her annoyed thought that she'd like to see it torn down like some third-world dictator turned into an idea. Marble. Dos mio pasto kai tangan canaso. As the others passed her, Hermione quickly ran her wand in a diagonal line across the base of the statue, just above the heads of the sculpted muggles, and whispered, Anaplaso! The general spell she had invented to rearrange atoms where she didn't have a more specific charm. It was harder, but the transformation she needed was laughably simple, a tiny change leveraged to a huge effect. She didn't need to change the molecules, she just needed to alter the crystal structure in a thin slab through the stone, from an interlocking mosaic to a mathematical structure called an opaline sphere packing. There was a tremendous rumble, and the crowd screamed and scattered as over 50 tons of marble rolled down off its pedestal on a carpet of thousands upon thousands of pearls, like so many ball bearings. It fell to the ground with a thunderous crash, and the ascendant witch and wizard broke into pieces right in Yaxley's face. She heard him shout as he was knocked to the ground. Hermione nodded once with satisfaction and ran to catch up. She cast Attathicula again, ripping open another fireplace. The order wasted no time. Hestia, Fred, and Sirius flew out. George paused just before he stepped into the fire. "Damn, that was hot," he said, and stepped through. Hermione smiled in spite of everything. "Horrors, after them!" Yaxley bellowed. He was up again, limping now, still more mobile than Hermione was, but he'd taken a beating, and he was mad. He staggered towards them as fast as he could, nearly on them now. "Harry, hurry!" Hermione cried. She stood her ground, trying to shield Harry's escape. He dove through the flue, and she followed, but she wasn't quite fast enough. Even as she felt the fireplace whisk her along with a rush of air, she felt a hand grab the back of Hopkirk's suit jacket. Yaxley's hands wrapped around her throat as they tumbled out of the toilet cubicle. She didn't hesitate. She turned on the spot and apparated to the factory. They landed on the floor. Yaxley hesitated just a moment in surprise, and that hesitation cost him. Surrounded by a dozen hostile wands, he went down before he could blink. Everyone stared as Hermione pushed him off her. Fred broke the silence. "Bloody hell, we got him?" "Yeah, we got Yaxley," Emmeline said. "That was too easy," Harry said suspiciously. "Easy?" Hestia snapped. "Mad I bloody died down there!" "It still shouldn't have been that easy to trap him," Harry insisted. Kingsley's deep voice cut in. "Yaxley was not expecting to be apparated directly to our base of operations," he said. "The Death Eaters know we use the Fidelis charm, and only the Secret Keeper is capable of apparating in with a passenger." Hermione gasped as all eyes turned to her. That last desperate move had been pure luck. If she weren't the Secret Keeper, she wouldn't have been able to apparate here at all. But even so, they'd caught him. Umbridge was out of commission, and... "Runcorn?" she asked. "He's where I left him," Harry said. "What do we do with him?" He pointed to Yaxley. "He knows the secret now." "We'll have to kill him," Fred said. "No, I will not condone executing prisoners," Kingsley said. "That would make us as bad as they are." "I'm not keen on it either, but he's kind of right," George said. "We can't hold him anywhere, can we? He knows where the factory is, and even if he can't tell the other Death Eaters, we wouldn't be safe from him." "We could obliviate him, maybe," Harry offered. "No good," Sirius corrected him. "Obliviation can be reversed by legilimency, or failing that, torture." At this point, Hermione dropped to her knees beside Yaxley and reached into her handbag, retrieving a vial. "I have a solution," she said, aching, but still pushing through it to finish the job. "What is that?" Sirius asked. "I call it blissful ignorance." She uncorked the potion. "It's a modification on the cocktail we used on Malfoy in second year. Forgetfulness potion with a sedative component. It wipes the last hour of memory and makes it unrecoverable." She paused and thought. "I don't like it, but I can't be made to work over a longer period, so I think it's a reasonable concession to these circumstances." Several of the Order looked impressed, but Sirius wasn't one of them. "That's not a complete fix, Hermione,"
he said. "The way the Fidelis charm works, even if he doesn't remember and can't remember, he's still in on the secret. He could find this place again."
"No, he won't," she said coldly. She waved her wand at Yaxley's face and uttered, "Dornrotion!" A mist emerged from her wand and settled on the Death Eater's face. It had no discernible effect, except that he seemed to slip deeper into unconsciousness. "Briar Rose?" Hestia said. She nodded. "Kingsley's right. We can't stoop to executing prisoners. Too dangerous to let go, yes. Killing them in battle, yes. But killing them when they're bound and wandless?" "It happens in war," Hestia said. "You know it does." "Yes, I know it does, but it's not supposed to," she said. "In the Muggle world there are rules of engagement. We're already bending them here, but I'm not going to cross that line, even as a rebel group. In the Muggle world, any rebellion powerful enough to win will also have the facilities to hold prisoners. We don't have that luxury, so I've been thinking about it and I came up with this."
"What is it?" Kingsley demanded.
"I suppressed his reticular activating system. He's in a deep coma and literally incapable of waking up. It's like the Draught of Living Death in spell form, except it works differently. Wiggenweld potion won't wake him, only this specific counter curse." Her friend's eyes widened, and they subconsciously took half a step back. She knew that that was some serious curse crafting on her part, but it seemed like the best possible compromise. "Even like this, we'll still need the resources to keep him alive," Kingsley pointed out.
"No, we won't," Hermione said. "That's the other part of my plan. Draught of Living Death would look conspicuously odd to Muggles, but his coma won't. We'll drop him off at a Muggle hospital with no ID. A Catholic hospital, so we'll know that they won't pull the plug."
"Pull the plug?" George said. Everyone else just looked shocked at the notion.
She sighed. "Withdraw care because they think there's no hope of recovery. They'll keep him alive. If it's a really serious issue, we can compensate them later. We'll disillusion his dark mark. It'll last long enough on a target that small. It's the same thing I was going to do to Runecorn."
She stopped.
"Unless you object, Kingsley. You have the final call if you're not comfortable. It's some risk to the Muggles, but it shouldn't be much."
Everyone looked at Kingsley. He thought for a moment, then shook his head. "No, I don't think we'll come up with a better option," he said. "You've clearly thought this through carefully, Hermione. It's the best way to keep them out of the way for the duration without crossing that line. Do it." A few hours later, both Yaxley and Runecorn were ensconced in Muggle hospitals in different cities with no identification and a bit of magical modification to their facial features. Nothing that would stand up to even a cursory magical investigation, but enough that the Muggle doctors wouldn't connect them to any missing persons reports that might be disseminated to the Muggle world. As far as the Death Eaters would be able to tell, they would have just dropped off the face of the earth. Even Yaxley's dark mark wouldn't give him away without him being conscious to use it. Hermione and the others got some much-needed medical care of their own. The job was done, despite the losses. The prisoners were released, and 2 of the 3 masterminds behind the hunting of Muggleborns were out of the picture. As for the third... "I just got word from Augustus," Sirius started.
"Don't need to know,"
Hermione cut him off. The Order really needed that compartmentalization. "Right, sorry," he said sheepishly. "Anyway, I heard through the grapevine about what happened to Umbridge. It sounds like you did a real number on her." "Really? What did you do to Umbridge, Hermione?" George said. "Fred wouldn't even say anything." Hermione didn't answer. Harry turned slightly green and shook his head. "What, that bad?" Harry insisted.
I lost my temper,"
she said softly.
"Well, lost your temper or not, it was damn impressive," Sirius said, a little too gleefully.
"Hermione, what did you do?" George said, worriedly, looking between them. "Did you kill her?" Hermione still didn't answer, but Sirius answered for her. "The last I heard, they was still trying to figure out what was done to her," Sirius said. "All I know is, they say when they hauled her out of the Ministry, she looked like a modern art sculpture, and she was still alive."